Good morning.
I think we're all really just about here now, ready to begin. But one question, can our audience get on right away? Don?
They have already joined us.
Okay,
Anne-Marie, the audience is on, okay? We're live now.
Good morning. I am Anne-Marie Carlson, Chair of the Committee on Teaching about the United Nations. CTAUN. Today, our group of educators is pleased to present our first webinar. During this period of uncertainty, we've moved from organizing and holding large conferences at UN headquarters to planning webinars which can be accessible to you at your homes, schools, and offices. We're very pleased to announce that we have over 365 registrants today. CTAUN's conference has always focused on UN-related concerns. And here I call to mind last February's War No More conference and that of the prior year, Our Planet, Our Crisis, What's Next? See our website, www.teachun.org, for detailed info on our past conferences at the UN and at sites around the country. Plus, please stay tuned for our next webinar on Sunday afternoon, January 24th at 3 p.m., which is the International Day of Education. Our focus will be on the indigenous peoples of the world. Planning has begun and registration will be opening by the end of this month. Today's webinar, Combating a Pandemic of Misinformation, Teaching media literacy, focuses on the misinformation enveloping us with suggestions to help us and our students, colleagues, and communities survive and move ahead responsibly. The program, consisting of key addresses from leaders, panel presentations by students, along with quizzes, videos, and resources for all. We're opening with a short video focusing on the 5 C's of critical consuming. Let's see that now.
With digital tools, it is easier than ever to create, edit, and publish your work to the world. But there's a cost. It's also easier than ever to spread misinformation, and fake news has become a real issue in recent times. We see this with students. According to a Stanford study, only 25% of high school students were able to identify an accurate news story compared to a fake one. Students also had a hard time distinguishing between real and fake photographs, as well as authentic and staged videos. Researchers use the words bleak and dismaying to describe this, but it's not going away anytime soon, and that's a very real problem. So how do we fix it? Well, here's a 5-step process that I've used with students. A word of caution, it's not perfect and there are probably other models out there, but I thought I would share it just in case you might want to use it. We call it the 5 C's of critical consuming. Number 1, context. Look at the context of the article. When was it written? Where does it come from? Have the events changed since then? Is there any new information that could change your perspective? Number 2, credibility. Check the credibility of the source. Does the site have a reputation for journalistic integrity? Does the author cite credible sources? Is it satirical? Is it on the list of fake news sites? Is it actually an advertisement posing as a real news story? Number 3, construction. Analyze the construction of the article. What is the bias? Are there any loaded words, any omissions, any propaganda techniques? Can you distinguish between the facts and the opinions? Or is it merely a bunch of speculation? Number 4, corroboration. Corroborate the information with other credible news sources. Make sure it's not the only source making this claim, and if it is, there's a good chance it's not actually true. Number 5, compare. Compare it to other news sources to get a different perspective. Find other credible sources from other areas of the ideological or political spectrum to provide nuance and get a bigger picture of what's actually going on. When we teach students media literacy and they learn how to consume critically, they learn how to think critically. And critical thinking citizens are good for democracy. And that, well, that's good for everyone.
Let's try to remember those 5 C's: context, credibility, construction, corroboration, and compare as we look at all the media coming our way. We will be using the Q&A section visible at the bottom of your screen and encourage you to post any questions you might have there. It's our intent to answer them towards the end of the webinar. Mahir Nasser is our opening keynote speaker. He is Director of the Outreach Division in the UN's Department of Global Communications and Commissioner General of the UN at Dubai's Expo to be held next fall in Dubai. Mahir has worked for the UN in multiple posts in Vienna, Cairo, Amman, Jerusalem, and Gaza. We're grateful to Mahir for his excellent presentations, as some of you likely recall at CTAUN's past conferences in both Texas and Georgia, along with those at the UN. On a different front, we've also enjoyed encouraging him while he was completing several New York City marathons with the goal of raising funds for most deserving students in Gaza. But today, we're so pleased that he could join us here. Welcome, Mahir, to CTAUN's first virtual event.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and great to be part of the CTAUN first virtual event ever. And I hope, for the sake of our humanity and planet, that it will be the last virtual event, and that in the next one we will be able to be together at the United Nations, as we have usually enjoyed hosting you and interacting with you in person. Thank you also for the reference to my marathon and to CTAUN's support. That meant a lot to me at the time, and I think if it wasn't for that support, I wouldn't have been able to join you directly to complete one, let alone 3 marathons. So normally we would welcome you to the United Nations, but now let's say this is a virtual event. So I would like to welcome you on behalf of the United Nations, on behalf of the department, your long-term partner in engaging and enabling an exchange with experts from the United Nations, with colleagues, with leaders, to help the subject of teaching about the United Nations. And thank you for choosing a topic that is at the foremost of our effort and has been for the last 6 months. I will now share my screen and maybe go over a presentation, because that can help share with you some of the thinking and some of the activities that we have been engaged with over the last, I think, let me see if this is going to work. I'm not sure if it's working. Share. It seems that my computer is not optimized to share my screen on Zoom. If I may ask, I have shared the presentation with Peter. Can you share it from your end, and I will go over it with you, if you don't mind? That's the challenge with virtual.
But we'll make it right real soon.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Thank you very much. So at the beginning of the crisis, it was obvious that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be one of the most challenging pandemics the humans have known in this century, and actually for 100 years since the United Nations was created. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, tasked the department for developing a communications response that enables us to offer the correct information based on facts, information based on science, and also information that promotes solidarity and directs humanity in the right direction for the recovery. If we can go to the next. So we did launch a COVID-19 UN Communication Response Initiative in the spring of this year. That was anchored in the communication strategy of the department, which was also approved and developed this year, that thinks in terms of what are we communicating, why care, and what next. And that is around the context of leading the narrative, inspiring people to care, and mobilizing action. So how do we interpret this strategy for this crisis? Next slide, please. So the first, it was clear that there are different things that we have to do. We have to fight the virus, and therefore make sure that information, the WHO as the lead expert UN agency on this is available. So if you go to the UN website, un.org, there's now a very, very prominent location or page for COVID-19 that has the latest information updates on the virus from WHO and others. Then tackling the devastating social economic impact. Of course, with the closures came a lot of loss of income. Businesses closed, people needed support throughout. So that was the other important issue, that governments needed to interfere and support the needy. And then the third element was that when we get to recovery, we have to make sure that we recover better. There has never been a greater need for accurate and verified information. Next one, please. What was clear is that with the virus, COVID-19, wreaking havoc across the world, another virus of misinformation was also making its way to people's cell phones, social media feeds, information, and then being transmitted even in settings. And that we saw that not only in the US, we saw it all over the world in different languages, rumors and conspiracy theories about how to diagnose yourself and what is causing the virus. It's real, it's not real, it's a conspiracy, etc., etc. All of that not only complicated the effort, but also cost lives. There were some people who actually, there was a couple of stories in the media in the spring about at least 800 people having died from ingesting substances that they thought would protect them from COVID-19. So what we wanted to do, to respond to the Secretary General's call, is to flood the internet with science-based facts, facts that are based on science that leads us to solutions, but also that inspire solidarity and empathy. So we had to think differently. We had to go beyond what we normally do, which is relying on our traditional platforms and social media and products. So we partnered with a company called Purpose, which is one of the world's leading social media mobilizing organizations. And the collaboration with Purpose was also matched with regular updates and connections with the entire UN system, with the different UN agencies that are active and impactful on this, as well as the UN system of resident coordinators and UN information centers throughout the world, 131 UN country teams, 129 resident coordinators and communication colleagues with them. Next, please. So the Secretary General, as I said, has asked us to flood the internet with fact, science, while countering the growing scourge of misinformation, a poison that that has really putting even more lives at risk. So if we created a website called shareverified.com, we invited people to register with their email and provided on the website also assets and content that they can use to counter the flow of misinformation, how to identify, similar to the video that we just saw, tips on how to identify misinformation, how to best seek out what is correct and where to find it. So the verified website has now, we have over 110,000 people who have registered, who have become information volunteers. They receive regular emails with updates from verified, from us, that are collected from what WHO has developed, from other agencies have developed, and then channeled and shared with colleagues, with those volunteers, encouraging them to share it. And we do this in 9 languages, not just 1. So if you go next one, please. Of course, the COVID-19 has caught most countries unprepared. So there was a health emergency, social economic emergency, but also the misinformation that we are now, actually you are focusing on. And one of the things that became clear to us is that there is need for what is called digital literacy, and that literacy today isn't necessarily, and teaching children at school and maybe even adults, us, in the field of social media, isn't just about reading and writing and arithmetic and math. It's also about knowing how to distinguish what is correct and what is not, and how, even with the real fakes, something that you see in a video, the person speaking isn't actually that person, these words aren't their words. This is something that is being created. So that was something that is very, very clear. What we also thought was necessary is engaging with the platforms that people are using to share that information. So we have been engaging with the social media platforms, with large networks of mobilizer of media, and making sure that they themselves, and you will have seen, some of them have taken steps, not necessarily just because of our effort, but I think there's been a compounded effort by others as well, that information that is clearly incorrect is flagged, it is removed, and so on and so forth. So that is important, but also we cannot wait for the platforms to reach those, to take those steps. So what we try to do through Verified is to create a process of behavioral change based on science, based on research, that most people are prompted to share something the minute they see it. If you interrupt that euphoria of sharing something that makes you happy, that makes you angry, that makes you surprised, if you interrupted that and allow a few minutes of critical thinking, during which you will discover that the information that you're about to share is outdated, it's wrong, there's no source, contradicts common logic, then you wouldn't share it. So that was some of that was at the core of what we tried to do and developed. If we go to the next slide, and if you go to the next slide, please. So these are some of the tools, some of the products that I was talking about that were developed in partnership with Purpose. We also worked with some of our old partners that we have been working with around the SDGs, like Hello Kitty, Messengers of Peace, Goodwill Ambassadors, to share some of that content, how to identify misinformation and what is better way of finding the correct information. Next slide, please. So Share Verified is available in 9 languages. People who are signed up get emails regularly. We have used information ambassadors. There's a storytelling portal that we have developed, and it's available. There's a trailer board that we share with partners, and one of the campaigns, yes, please go to the next stage, to create. We have created 2 spike moments in the campaign. One was in June, which was the hashtag Take Care Before You Share. And the second one was in October, when we encouraged everybody to take a pause, pledge to pause before you share something. And that moment of pause is to give you that element of critical thinking to decide before you share something. Is it accurate? Is it correct? Does it make sense? Is it a trusted source? Will it hurt people? Because when somebody gets something from you, they will trust it because they trust you. So that's very important to really pay attention before you share anything. Next one, please. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'm trying to go faster than I need to be. But so pause, as I mentioned, is based on informed by academic and scientific research that show the effect of pausing. And that's the same concept that we are using now. We have actually worked with and commissioned a research university in Florida to see how do we tackle the next challenge that we have, which is the challenge of vaccine hesitancy. Now that we have reached this level of the pandemic where a vaccine was successfully developed within a record period, less than a year, public opinion surveys have shown that a significant number of people in some countries, more than half of the population, have said that they would not take the vaccine. And without the vaccine itself will not stop the pandemic, vaccination will. So what we need to make sure is that a critical number needed to create herd immunity accepts to take the vaccine. So addressing and tackling the issue of vaccine hesitancy was the next step for us and it's the same thing because we have seen a lot of misinformation around vaccines. And if you go to the next slide, please. So 2021, we see a challenge of it being the year of recovery, but also it's an opportunity to leverage the communication strategy to promote vaccine confidence, drive climate action, and mobilize for a brighter future. So now that we have created this machinery, this brand of verified, it isn't just about COVID-19 because the concept of misinformation, disinformation also applies to climate change in the same way it applied to cigarettes and a nicotine addiction in the 70s and the 80s. There will be people who will argue, they come up with conspiracy theories, they're motivated by their own self-interests and sometimes misguided. So we see this as an opportunity as we move to recovery. How do we use this notion and this brand of tackling misinformation to, again, find a silver lining in this pandemic? When we go to recovery, we recover on sound grounds, we recover on renewable, green, sustainable footage. Next slide, please. So the vaccine confidence is a project, and the way we're focusing now is how do we reduce the number of vaccine hesitant people by increasing the volume and reach of persuasive, pro-science, pro-vaccine content. And the second element in that is that increased support for COVAX accelerator that will enable us to reach the number of vaccines needed for the world and the concept of a people's vaccine that is free and available to all. And the last slide, please. So verified vaccine content, we are working with, again, with some people who are actually working. We have created a project called Project Halo, where we have identified a few dozen scientists who are working on developing the vaccine themselves or other aspects of work with the vaccination process. And we have created slides that show the benefit of vaccines and how they have had a significant role in developing and saving lives. And it's all available on the website that we have created. I said shareverified.com, and the second website is takecarebeforeyoushare.org. And I know that I've gone beyond the time allotted to me, so I will stop here. Thank you very much, and look forward to the engagement at the end of the session.
Thank you so very much, Mahir, for sharing the excellent work that the UN has been doing in getting all this information out to us. And remember, all of you, please use shareverified.com and take care before you share.org. I'm sorry about mixing up those two a little bit there, but this will all be available to you folks. Thank you again, Mahir. Moving on, Ramu Damodaran is our moderator for today's CTAUN webinar. Ramu is chief of the UN's Academic Impact Initiative, UNAI, and he works closely with his group, with colleges and universities worldwide. He oversees these over 1,400 institutions of higher learning that have aligned themselves with the UN in supporting UN goals and mandates, such as the promotion and protection of human rights, access to education, sustainability, etc. Ramu has been a very active member of CTAUN's Advisory Council and has also spoken at a number of our conferences at the UN and around the country. We're very happy to have him here as our moderator, and he'll also be our closing speaker today. Ramu, may we see you and hear from you now.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I think you probably can both now. I'm very grateful to the introduction that you provided, the 5 C's, context, credibility, construction, corroboration, comparison. To that, I would add a 6th C, and that C stands for CTAUN. And the work that you've done, you're now approaching your 25th year. You, Anne-Marie, have been involved since 1996 when the committee started. And when you celebrate your Silver Jubilee next year, it will be, I hope, as Mayor said, not a virtual, but a physical celebration. And I mention that because of my good fortune in being associated with CTAUN over these years. With you, Anne-Marie, with Don, who's always been our resident photographer, capturing the moments that we've had at conferences together. With Elizabeth, who has really put this event together. Elizabeth's Twitter handle is the very intriguing Eco Schumann, which I presume is her full name. But if you look at that, EKOSHUMAN, it could also stand for Eco is Human. And I think of that because the very first CTAUN conference I attended in 2002 had an address by Robert Kennedy Jr., who was then a professor at Pace University, where he spoke about the confluence of 2 ecos, ecology and the economy, and how vital they are to education and the society that we wish to shape for ourselves. So thank you, Elizabeth, for putting this together. Thank you, Connie. I know that you're with us as well today, and our other friends from CTAUN, whom I will introduce later in the course of this program. Meher mentioned in his remarks how important it is to distinguish right from wrong. And we can look at this from 2 ends of the telescope, if you will. From one point, we're looking at it from the point of view of misinformation, about how misinformation misguides us and causes us to believe or to accept what is false as the truth. But the converse is equally true, because of misinformation, we crowd out the truth. We are not prepared to hear the truth. We are not prepared to believe or be persuaded or to act upon the truth. And this again came to me very vividly in mind at the conference, the first CTAUN conference I attended in 2002, where there was a remarkable young man. His name was Jean-Dominique. He was from Canada. And when he was 10 years old, he contracted cancer. And he tried to find out why this had occurred to him. And he finally traced it to the herbicides which would be used in golf courses near Montreal. And he started a campaign, but no one believed him because misinformation was crowding out true information. But finally he succeeded, and soon golf courses across Canada made the use of herbicides illegal. At the 2003 conference, I came across a remarkable man called Leslie Morrow at Rutgers University, who coined something called Confuse-a-bet, using the alphabet to mislead by juggling up letters And the metaphor for that was using facts to mislead. Fast forward to the first CTAUN conference I attended outside New York, Atlanta in 2008. And Professor Jonathan Todres from the Georgia Law School. And he made the very important point that the United States had not signed or ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child because people were A, misinformed about what the convention was, and B, they were misinformed about what the United Nations could do as an enforcement agency for conventions that member states had signed. And he made a very compelling case. If people knew the facts rather than falsehoods they had been peddled, it would have made a difference. So in this long struggle, which goes far beyond 2020, CTAUN has been in the forefront, and all of us at the United Nations are very grateful. It's now my privilege to introduce our second speaker, a friend, a fellow member of the Advisory Council, and someone with whom I have that most cherished of relationships, reader and author, Erwin Arieff, who has worked for a number of years with Reuters in Washington, in Paris, and in New York at the United Nations, and is now a contributing writer to Pass Blue. I once spoke to Erwin and I heard from him how his first real encounter with misinformation came at the university. He was a student at UPenn, and his physics professor once told the class how he had got out of a speeding ticket by telling the judge that the peculiar shape of the front of his car deflected the radar waves and caused him to speed. And the judge, completely oblivious to physics as he was, accepted the explanation and waived the speeding fine. So, Erwin, that's your heritage. And now we invite you to speak to us on fact or fiction.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And as Ramu said, hello, my name is Bob Erwin, a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and I'm delighted to be participating in this seminar, this webinar put together by the Accuracy in Media Institute. I'm speaking to you from London, following my recent retirement as the editor of the New York Times with a specialty in media studies. And everything I've just said to you is completely fabricated, aimed at showing how easy it is to be an emissary of misinformation. The era we're passing through at this time of pandemic and national strain has been a horrific one for so many of us for so many reasons. But it will also go down as one of the most trying in the long history of the news business. During the US election campaign that just took place, the news media, it seems, did a pretty horrible job of keeping the nation informed on what was going on and of predicting where things might be headed, albeit operating under challenging circumstances. But in addition to mistakes like, say, deifying the polls, the US media collectively spewed extraordinary amounts of political misinformation at an astounding rate around the world in a largely out of control fashion, leaving billions of people utterly misinformed. The upshot? Many of us had the mistaken impression that we understood what was going on around us when we actually understood very little. In fact, people around the world, and particularly in the United States, had been steadily trained ahead of the election year to tolerate, if not accept and even embrace, utterly false information in a routine fashion. Not just the understandable and even familiar falsehoods of the past that we've all grown accustomed to hear, on the order of, I will be the president of all the people, or I am the candidate of change, but the type of falsehoods that have flowed for years from a deeply flawed individual at the center of our political system. Who can forget such classic sound bites as windmills cause cancer? That's fake news, and the election has been stolen. So sadly, I'm deeply heartbroken these days when I look at my own business, swelled to include newly coined bloggers, websites, newspapers, radio stations, TV and cable broadcasts, never mind Facebook, that eagerly accepted and even encouraged and fabricated the lies and amplified them across the country and around the world, while giving little thought to the impact of these actions on our democracy, a wonder of the world that I have always deeply admired. No question, journalism is undergoing explosive changes. First, there was the extraordinary growth of social media that led to ego booster sites like Twitter, and more recently, its new conservative counterpart, Parler. Parler invites conservatives and others to tweet out their opinions without having to worry about encountering anyone who disagrees with them or seeing their tweet labeled as deceptive or disputed. Then we witnessed the growth of the new wacko world of media, populated by such egregiously anti-truth outfits as the One American News Network and Newsmax, and its more extreme neighbors like Gateway Pundit and InfoWars. These in turn work side by side with many more traditional but aggressively partisan organizations like the Fox News cable network and the Washington Examiner, a newspaper in Washington. All have chosen to bend the traditional media model by becoming one of the players to the political world with a fixed point of view rather than work as a neutral observer. And they've shifted the concept of news in dangerous new directions. Rather than encounter an interesting set of facts and try to convey that to the news consumers out there, the goal in this world is to create a report that attracts large numbers of ideologically like-minded readers who can be counted on to click on an item and then repeat or repost it on other like-minded sites, ever expanding the tale's reach. Rather than inform the public, the focus for so many of these new types of media is to promote a particular ideology or point of view, and to thereby nourish and finance it through online clicks. Truth has no role in this. So what exactly is the downside of this newly emerging media model? Above all, they're missing true facts and the basic concept that their own set of what we've now come to know as alternative facts somehow are connected to reality. In the new model, reality has no role. A big part of that is a lack of objectivity. News stories have always allowed opinions to sneak in, but in the new model, there's not even a pretense of neutrality, only ideology. The whole point is to portray the creator's set of facts as the only one, even when it has no truth to it. So are we witnessing the end of the idea that a great democracy can thrive only if it's well informed on topics of social importance? Looking backwards for a moment, the news business has always been vulnerable to criticism over a major flaw in its fundamental structure. News organizations, whatever their form, are money-making enterprises. The consumers of their news must pay for it, whether through subscriptions or by putting up with advertising that appears on the page alongside the news. The consumer keeps the news organization alive by occasionally buying the products that appear in the ads. Why is that a big problem? Well, the profit motive may be keeping the news business alive, but historically it's also been an incentive to sensationalism. The wilder and more bizarre your stories, the more eager certain types of consumers are going to be to pay for them. Think of the National Enquirer, which is now in kind of a dumb phase. It's not really working very much these days. And its regular interviews with space aliens. Traditionally, however, the news consumer always knew where the news came from. Things couldn't get too out of control, could they? If the newspaper or TV station or whatever was located right down the street in a brick and mortar office building or underneath that transmitter tower standing in the nearby cornfield, the community of news consumers knew where they could find it. The internet has deeply undermined that model. Most internet news does not require a subscription, and advertising is typically less intrusive. We still buy subscriptions to print media and increasingly to certain internet-based media, but few media outfits gain enough subscribers to actually cover their costs. Think of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Politico as rare examples. But the new internet media are not necessarily in it for the money. Some may be getting money from advertisers through clicks, but mysterious unknown individuals and organizations might also be picking up the tab, simply because they love the false ideas they're spreading. And they can be located anywhere, and consumers have no idea of knowing where that is. So the news providers can make stuff up and no one even knows who they are or where they're working? Is it a big office in Los Angeles? Or some 17-year-old working from his bedroom in his parents' house in El Paso? Fortunately, there are still a few of us interested in what we used to refer to as the truth, even if it is difficult to pin down. Facts still matter. So what's a news consumer to do? How does an everyday kid who may not want to subscribe to the New York Times or the Washington Post or Politico figure out what they're looking at on the internet today? Have you just encountered a story with a baffling angle that has left your head spinning? Here's some advice you will hear repeatedly today in various formats, but it's worth repeating. Experts advise paying attention to your initial reaction. If your reaction is, wow, I have to share this on Facebook right away, please pause first and do some quick research. It may be the post you see is true, but it also might be too good to be true. Or it may be so outrageous, it makes you furious. Remember that online, sharing, liking, and reposting are the root of all evil when false news is the target. Here are 4 steps one organization, the News Literacy Project, has told you should follow before sharing a suspect media report. Number 1, pause. Don't let your emotions take over. Number 2, glance through the comments. Has anyone replied to this with a fact check? 3, do a quick search in the search bar. Turn the claim you're checking into a question. Look for credible sources in the results. 4, try and determine the source. Reply to the person who shared the post, asking for the original source or link for other evidence supporting the claim. Raising this where others can see it lets them know that the claim is questionable. As the News Literacy Project puts it, once you've followed these steps, if you find credible evidence that a post isn't true, alert others in a reply. If the post is dangerous or harmful, report it. If you still aren't sure that the post is true, don't share it. And in general, try to read and view and listen to a lot of news from as many sources as possible. The more you learn about the various sources, the better equipped you will be to judge their content. Here are some resources for students and teachers to help you learn more about misinformation. A more detailed list with links is available on the CTAUN website. And don't be tempted to tune out of the debate over truth in media. Smart news consumers control the future of the news business. We can push for truth and integrity in reporting, or wake up one morning to an array of alternative facts and few gatekeepers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Erwin, for that. And thank you for that very important concept about democracy, that great democracies can only function if they're well informed. And I think that's true of national democracies, and it's certainly true of the global democracy that the United Nations aspires to be. And to be well informed means listening to people, listening to their views, and infusing those views into policy. In the Department of Global Communications, Meher, my chief, leads the effort to really integrate youth into the deliberations of this organization. And we in the Academic Impact are privileged to play our part. And it's now my honor to invite the youth panel and the directors at large of CTAUN, Eileen Venezia and Peter Brosnan, who will introduce them.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Online Literacy and a view of fact-based research in today's classrooms. Before I introduce our youth panel, I'd like to just share a tidbit about this wonderful group. Because of the platform we're using today and the conditions that we're all faced with, our group contains 4 of us, and we decided that we would rate them according to their level in education to share with us what is being learned inside their classrooms. This little band of troubadours, as I refer to them, has made great strides in this crazy uncharted territory. And now I'm pleased to introduce Gianna Barcia from SUNY Binghamton, along with Sean O'Hagan from Oceanside High School, Hannah Shu from Pace University, and our distinguished graduate and director at large, Peter Bronson. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're okay today. And I need to also let everyone know that Gianna has to rush to take a final right after this. And there have been many, many meetings that we've encountered together. And Hannah on her way home from New York to the state of Washington, accepting phone calls and text messages. So they have worked diligently for this period of time. Sean, you being the youngest member of our group, I'd like to ask you, as you're now getting ready to think about universities and colleges and fields of study you might want to become involved with, how has research been conducted in your classroom?
Well, as early as middle school, we were taught to use fact-checking websites such as Snopes and factcheck.org in order to verify or to determine whether a source is reliable or not. But if we couldn't get to those websites or we didn't have the time to get to those websites, we were taught strategies in order to determine if a source is reliable. We would look at the author, see what past articles he's wrote about, see if he's a biased author. We would also check the date of the article, whatever event it was talking about, to see if it was primary, it was a few days after the event took place, or if it was years after. We'd always have primary sources above secondary sources. It's what we were taught. We would see what the article was posted on, what it was published on, whatever news site it was published on. Let's for say Fox News, CNN, CBS, to see if that news source is reliable. Just a few things we would look at in order to determine if an article or a source we were going to use in a research paper or even a regular assignment would be good to use.
Mhm. That's excellent, because I find that to be the stepping stone for your preparation for the university level. I'm curious about were there any specific subjects that was really promoted for?
I think you see that most in a literature or a social studies class.
Mm.
It's social studies and English, those two subjects are more seen as they have a larger variety than math and science. I feel you see a lot of equations or in math and science more so than actual research
Right.
basing something off. You'd see it more so in an advanced placement class, I feel. They're more how do you put it? They're more conductive and they're more I wouldn't say intelligent, but they go more out of the way in order for us to learn. But overall, you see a lot more research assignments or just teaching digital literacy or how to decipher a source in both English and social studies classes.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sean. Our next question is for the group, so I would really like someone to just maybe jump out who would like to respond to this. But what social medias are the most popular both on and off campus. And as a part B to this question, I'd like to know if any of you have encountered or been placed in situations where maybe your reputation on campus or has been compromised. Someone like to challenge that or tackle that?
I would love to. So, Snapchat, Instagram, and Facebook, I would say, are probably the top 3 platforms used by most college students. Snapchat is a messaging app that lets users exchange pictures and videos that are meant to disappear after they're viewed. So, after about 10 seconds, these snaps, they go away. Instagram is a photo and video sharing app in which people can upload their media to share with their followers or their friends. Um, One thing that I would really like to point out on with all of these platforms, for one example, with Snapchat, because this media tends, well, because it does disappear in 10 seconds, most people think that this media is totally inaccessible, that this is just absolutely disappears into some abyss that we don't really know where this goes. We just know it's gone. However, Snapchat holds on to metadata, just like any other social media platform, from content sent through Snapchat. And this could be used by government officials, court officers, in the case if, for example, if you were to be caught with a DUI. Now, if you're caught with a DUI, and if you go out to a party and you post on Snapchat or Instagram or even Facebook, it doesn't really matter because they all hold on to the same thing. It's very easy to track down the events of the night, especially if you're one of those people that posts everything that you do. So, for example, if you were caught with a DUI, the pictures or content posted on accounts can provide officials with a timeline of events that led up to the event of you driving intoxicated, whether that's if this information was stored or someone was able to simply just view your post. That is one example. Another example is, well, for Instagram at least, the company says it usually takes about 90 days to completely remove data. So if I'm posting things on Instagram that I kind of just want to temporarily throw out there, but I can't really keep it up for too long because I don't want certain people to see it, you delete it. However, researchers have found that even Twitter, along with Instagram, retains direct messages between users for years. So, I mean, if this isn't enough to, tell you be careful with what you post, one example that I always like to talk about is at my friend's college. So it was earlier this semester during the whole COVID-19 pandemic, where large gatherings we have seen to be a huge problem. So what the school did was, as their COVID cases started to rise up, they started doing contact tracing. And as they were doing more contact tracing, they realized it was around the same group of people, same age. So what they did was this college basically hired a panel that their main job was to go to social media and find out information about these large gatherings. And that's exactly what this college did. They went right to Instagram accounts and there was a themed party. So all they see is the same costume over and over again. And then through clicks and tags and comments and likes, they were able to pin out who was at this party, what time, how many people. And eventually these students lost their housing. A lot of them got fined for having the large social gathering, simply just because when they sat down and went to this meeting after receiving an email from student conduct, all of a sudden, the only evidence that's there is their Instagram pictures and their Snapchat posts. So as you can see, these are some examples of how social media can really put you in bad situations if you're not careful with what you post and share.
Well, Gianna, that's an amazing story. And I'm so happy that you shared it with all of us, because without our group right here, I mean, most of us, and especially the older adults that are viewing, and those of us as mothers and grandmothers, are not aware of what all of you are presented with on a daily basis. Thank you, Gianna. Hannah, I'm going to I'm going to directly address you because you're about to graduate. And I'm wondering, we know what's shared online has a very long lifespan, as Gianna just explained to us, and as we have even learned during our own research. Can you give us some aspirations or maybe describe to us the effect that can take place if we're not aware of this, and how can it affect our entry into higher education and maybe into the aspirations of a career in the future?
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, I am about to graduate. So, this is something that has been on my mind. And I think the most important thing is just to make sure that you're being cognizant about what you're putting out onto the internet. Because, like Gianna said, nothing ever really goes away. Even if you delete it, there's still going to be a way for it to be tracked down and found. So, um, and when you're looking to find a job or to go to a university, those companies and educational institutions are looking for candidates who have positive representations of themselves online. Because when they hire you or when they accept you as a student, you become a reflection of their brand. So they're looking for the most positive reflection possible. So the question I like to ask myself when I'm going to share something on social media is this something that I would want my grandmother to see? Because if it's not something I'd want my grandmother to see, it's probably not the best representation of me. And it's probably not something that a future employer would want to see, or an admissions counselor. So, if used correctly, also your social media presence can your social media presence can actually be an asset when you're entering the workforce or applying to schools, as long as you're presenting yourself in the best light.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, and congratulations. And thank you for your effort and your traveling and your phone calls in between your traveling. Lastly, I'd like my colleague, Peter Bronson, who has already graduated from Manhattanville and is our additional CTAUN Director at Large. I'd like him to just leave us with some comments. As our youth envoy, Peter, can you just give us some hope as to the possibilities that the role of social media has for us, as well as how can we avoid both what Gianna has spoken about and what Hannah has spoken about? And how can we cross that bridge between fact and fiction while using social media?
I'd love to answer all those questions. So as Sean mentioned, there's a lot of tools and techniques that can be employed in both academic settings and personal settings. But a lot of these are taught and should be taught and drilled into students in lower and upper education. When you're taught who to be and how to be, you should be taught how to read and how to interact with the information you gather. As Gianna mentioned, these platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and many more are both a help but also a hindrance. These platforms can have disastrous consequences. And as Hannah mentioned, you're more than just you online. You're the version of you that you want others to see. And you have to make sure and take critical steps to ensure that that is the best version of you, because it stays. It lingers longer than you. I think the most critical thing to remember is to pause. As I mentioned before in the presentation, the most helpful thing you can do to help yourself be happy and healthy online is to think before you share and think before you click. Because the second you click, it's always associated with who you are. It might not be the best thing to be associated with at all. Thank you.
Wow. I want to thank you all so much. And I feel like I'm bound by you now, my little group of troubadours. And I love you very much. And Gianna, good luck on your final today, and everyone else. And in closing, thank you again. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ramu.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you, Peter, and those wonderful contributions from Sean, Gianna, and Hannah. I'd now like to turn the floor over to another friend of CTAUN, Dr. Yu-Kyung Chang, who is a design researcher and lecturer at Teachers College in New York, and has been working especially in areas relating to online learning, media consumption behavior, and, to go back to the phrase that Meher used, media literacy education. Dr. Chang is an alumni of Yonsei University in Seoul, which is the university where our former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon now holds a chair. Dr. Chang?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I think we might have forgotten to roll the poll, but I will just continue with my talk because I'll integrate it into my talk. So I'm going to share my screen so I can talk. I can share some of the perspectives with you as I'm talking. So I'm Yu-Kyung Chang, and I am a learning experience designer. And what does that mean? So I design, I research, and I teach about how media can be used as a tool, but the environment that we learn with. And I love how today we have everybody from sharing different perspectives on the need for media literacy and navigating in the world of media and misinformation maybe and whatnot. And I really appreciate that I'm able to share the perspective from the media literacy education. So I would like to ask you to think quickly about questions. So how informed are you about the world around you? And how confident are you in identifying misinformation? So if you could take just a minute to answer the questions, that will be very helpful. So as you finish your, enter your, the response for the questions, I would like to continue talking about these things. So these are the questions that I often ask my students. And the response that I often get are different for these two questions. In other words, people see these questions as referring to something different. So when I ask, how informed are you about the world around you? People often think this refers to the amount of information, the quantity of information that you have access to. And when I ask the question of how confident are you in identifying misinformation, people think that this refers to a different level of using and accessing information. It's about being able to critically analyze, evaluate, and select information. And I would like to invite you to think differently about these two questions, and that these are somewhat related. So I think we have the poll results. And it seems like we do have a similar pattern, right, as of what I have just described. But what I would like you to think about along these two questions is the fact that how well informed we are is not only about the quantity of information that we have access to, but really the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act with information using all forms of communication. And this is the definition of media literacy that I borrowed from National Association for Media Literacy Education. So what I think there has been discussions and perspectives about the need for media literacy from multiple perspectives, from the students, from UN, and different initiatives out there. And so I would like to talk a little more about how to go about the media literacy and the problem of media literacy. I don't think I really need to emphasize why we should care about it. I think this is a sentiment that is shared across all of us here today. But media literacy really sets the foundation for us and how we understand the world around us and how we participate in it. And that's another aspect that I would really like to emphasize, that it's not only about finding the good information, but it's also about being able to create and share. Because the media and technology, while there are a lot of downsides and challenges to it associated with them, they're also very powerful tools that can empower us as global citizens. So Another aspect of media literacy and the need for it was also discussed earlier. WHO declared infodemic as one of the important challenges that we're facing along with the global pandemic. So media literacy is not only about being informed, but also could be a life and death matter. So the problem of misinformation and fake news, while we often think that this is something that is newly emerging with the media technologies that we have now, it actually is an old news. It has been around ever since the invention of print media. But the problem is becoming increasingly problematic and more challenging because the current media ecosystem allows for easy and fast creation and dissemination of misinformation. Also, despite the fact that media literacy and adopting these media literacy skills are difficult, people often have high confidence in their ability to exercise and practice these media literacy skills. And when it comes to youth population, there are further challenges to it as well. First of all, there are lots of documentation of low levels of civic reasoning online. Well, this is not only the problem of youth, but further, youth feel that the media and news and journalism is not relevant to them, and they have very little motivation in being engaged and finding relevance, and maintaining communication and engagement with the media. And also, there is well-documented phenomena or observation of mistrust and traditional media as well, which could cause further challenges in youth media literacy. So what can we do about it? So media literacy education is an effort that has been around for a while to provide these supports for media literacy across all lifespans, but especially with youth. But there are some significant challenges that are associated with media literacy education, which I would like to talk about. So one thing I think it was mentioned earlier is the fact that there is lack of recognition or shared recognition for the need of media literacy education. And so there is different types and modes of implementing media literacy education and curriculum within US, but across the globe. So that also goes to the different understanding of what media literacy skills should be fostered. And so there is lack of good resources that we can use that is comprehensive and covering and supporting media literacy skills that can be implemented into an educational experience. There is lack of training to educate teachers, educators, and staff in delivering these educational experiences. And there's lack of time that is actually allocated to integrate these educational initiatives into different educational systems. Another challenge is the fact that with the charged nature of current political landscape, when we start talking about media literacy, youth often engage in very charged, emotionally and politically charged debate, which leaves very little room for media literacy skills to be practiced and developed. And also the complex nature of media ecosystem entails different media literacy skills, complex and evolving media literacy skills to be fostered. So I'd like to share one approach that we have taken to address these challenges. At Media and Social Change Lab at Teachers College, one effort that we have made and continue to make is it's a game-based approach. So what we have done is we developed a card game, and now currently we're working on developing a digital game to foster media literacy in youth. And the game is available through TC Press if you're interested. So what we did with the game is it's a card game for media literacy that is set in a fictional world of green meadows. So there's no people, but there are sheep. And the way a player would win is by gathering as much evidence as they can to verify whether a sheep news is real or fake. So let me highlight some of the design considerations or important designs that we implemented in the game, which we think are very important considerations for media literacy education in general. One, we recognize that the media literacy skills are complex, and it doesn't only consist of knowing what to do, but how to do them. So and also that they're constantly evolving. So some of the examples that you can see with our the evidence cards that you can use in the game entails different types of strategies and skills that you would exercise as part of your media literacy skills. The other important aspect was to address the politically charged climate that we live in, not only in the US, but globally. So we took the advantage of the game design principle of being able to have suspension of disbelief and being able to integrate fictional narrative. And the game is placed in a sheep's meadow, and that will allow the players to talk about and engage in the media literacy skills without being engaged in a political discussion, which often takes away the attention into talking about the critical media skills. Another really important consideration that we made is the fact that the educators also need support. They need support in recognizing and supporting their own media literacy skills, but they also need support in recognizing and understanding their students' media literacy skills. Also, they also need support in integrating different educational materials into their curriculum. So as we implemented the game into a learning context and evaluated its effectiveness, we found that the game-based approach can be largely effective in supporting students' media literacy skills across different grade levels, subject matters, and contexts of learning in informal and formal learning. And also students were able to apply these skills that they practiced in the game into a real life example. And another really important finding was that the teachers indeed did need a lot of support. Some teachers were ready and were able to integrate this the game-based approach into their curriculum. Some teachers were a little challenged, and this really goes to the lack of or the need for support for the educators who are facilitating these media literacy educational initiatives. So I would like to conclude by saying that the media literacy skills and the needed media literacy skills will continue to evolve, and it's quite complex. And we do need to recognize that as part of the media literacy education, and that teachers and the educators need support just as anybody else in integrating this and facilitating them into their curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chang. Thank you for that presentation and for leading us into the interactive part of our program. Thank you also for conducting that poll. We've had a couple of questions posed to us. I'm going to begin with a reference to the documentary film Social Dilemma, which some of us may be aware of. Meher, are there any thoughts you would have on that film?
Thanks, Ramu. I mean, I think it's an important depiction of some of the ways that social media has made it into our lives, and the people from the industry itself talk about their work when they were employed by the Facebook and the other the media organizations. I think it's an important film. It looks at the algorithms that are employed to ensure that you spend as much time on those platforms as possible, because time is money. I mean, when you think about the biggest revenue source for these platforms is advertising. And advertising, because it's targeted, it's smart. You can look up something on Google or whichever other search engine, and then next thing you know, commercials for that item or something similar start appearing on your social media feed, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, and otherwise. And that's the power of these platforms. They're all about generating income for themselves, and the more time eyeballs that they can show that they have, then the higher premium they can ask of the producers. So the film looks at those issues. We're actually having an engagement with the director, Jeff Orlovsky, whom we actually hosted at the UN before. He had two other films, Chasing Coral and Chasing Ice, environment-based films. To say that just one should add that it isn't just the algorithms that are the problem. I think one also has to look at the social capitalist models and whether what role that plays in this culture of spend, 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 and culture of making sure that the only way to grow is to produce more things for people to consume more, to spend everything on items that we don't need. I mean, this culture, and that's why one of the SDGs that I often refer to that people don't talk about a lot is SDG 12, which is responsible production and consumption. And these are the things that we have to bear in mind. So it does look at the issue of the role of social media and the social dilemma in captivating our attention. And as we see, this media becomes a major spreader of misinformation, disinformation, whether it's about climate, whether it's about COVID, whether it's about elections, and so on and so forth. So we have to be extra careful. The way to deal with all of that is critical thinking.
Thanks so much, Mayor. And let me follow up on the consumption and production SDG and the theme with a question to Erwin, which has been posed by one of our audience. Which sources of news would you recommend to the consumer?
I unmuted here. Yeah, unmute myself. Okay. Hi, that's a tough question. The thing that's very disconcerting about what our country is undergoing at this time is we really do seem to have become divided into two camps. And without talking about the relative size of the camps, when I see, I will admit, I look at Facebook from time to time. I keep up with my friends on it, and I find it a very useful part of my life. But when I see a contentious issue posted on Facebook by someone I disagree with, I find that there are two camps. There are the people who believe A and the people who believe B, and there's no tween between them. There's no shared ground, and people divide up their media seemingly by what their perceived ideology is. I would like to think, as someone who worked in Washington for about 25 years as a reporter, and it was a different time when people trusted each other and everyone got along well, and there was no fake news really to speak of that I could tell. I would like to think that people would go to the traditional news media with gravitas, like Politico, like Washington Post, like New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, if you ignore the editorial page. And they will find that these are news organizations that have existed for 100 or sometimes some of them more than 100 years, that have the best staffs, the best journalists coming out of the best schools, and are schooled and experienced before they get jobs on groups like that, on outfits like that. And they're going to give you a more truthful and more broad news with perspective and balance, and that you should try and look for that kind of organization. If you've already made up your mind and you think that everybody is against you in the world and that no one understands what a great president we have right now, who is telling us nothing but the truth about the election, then you're not going to listen to my advice. But that would be my advice. Look for the outfit that has the best people working for it and the best reputation and the most standards and guidelines and safeguards, and go to them.
We had actually, Erwin, a follow-up question as you were speaking, and that is, can a journalist be truly unbiased?
Well, this is a good question also. Everyone has biases, and people can show their bias, I think now more than when I was just starting out in this business. People are almost invited to show their biases. Reporters across the country right now are allowed to tweet on Twitter, and everyone knows that Twitter is filled with people's opinions and nothing else. And I think this is a good thing, but I think also when people are writing or doing their video presentation or announcing a story on the radio or whatever, when they're doing this for their main publication, that they're going to be very careful. And if they sneak in a little bit of an opinion or give their point of view, with luck, it's one that's derived from experience and long knowledge of the facts and the situation. And they're going to do it responsibly and better, and not just make something up and then stick with it come hell or high water.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Erwin. I have a question now for Dr. Chang. This is from George Pitagorsky. What motivates consumers to buy into falsehoods and false news?
I think that is, there probably will be many different factors, right? And I think there are some that are maybe something in terms of the social capital. I think that's more of the social science approach to understanding why this is happening, right? We do have certain belief and biases, right? Not everybody has certain biases and belief that we have, and we want to maintain that. And that and by having that membership of a social group, and it enforces our agency and reinforces our belief as well in a comfort zone. And I think that psychologically, that might be one factor in us cater into things that we believe are reinforcing our beliefs. And that seems to sort of distract us from being very critical in the information that we come across. Also, the media landscape has not really made it very easy for us to be very critical and be exposed to different types of information or different perspectives. And I think these are very well documented since the previous, like 2016, for example. There has been a lot of study that has been done to see what is happening, and we hear about like the filter bubble or whatnot. And I think the social dilemma the documentary also sort of covers these perspective as well. So it's almost like the advertisement, right? So you are exposed to the same information over and over again, and with the familiarity effect, you do start to believe that it is a fact, even and that leaves very little room for you to exercise your critical thinking as well.
Thank you. And a question for our youth panel, or Eileen or Peter. In addition to your being educated, do you think it's important to educate, and the question uses the word elderlies, or are they past the stage of education?
I'd like, okay.
While Eileen's getting on here,
Yeah.
video on, I'll jump in and say, no one is ever past the point of education. You can educate yourself in any way at any time. You make the choice to educate yourself. You can read. I don't read enough. I know I could read more, but people read more and people read less. People read different news sources. People can watch different TV shows. Now, the perils of these platforms are also give us purpose, because they allow us to get such a range of information and different ways and methods. So if you aren't feeling up to reading it, you have a long day, you can just turn on the news, but just make sure you turn on a different channel every once in a while to stay or as unbiased as you can be. I would argue that, to reiterate, just because someone is older does not mean that their opinion matters any less or that their perspective is any less important. They have experience that they can share. So it's like yin and yang in a way. They've lived, they've seen things, they can share those things. When the youth haven't seen as much, but are growing up in a different time with different experiences entirely.
I'd like to add to that, everyone. I'd be remiss in not discussing how through history we see when a new technology is introduced, we tend to let the past technology fall back into the wayside. And I'm very concerned about the use of our public libraries, especially in our big cities and on our universities, because our students today and our children were born into this technology and platforms online, but I really am hoping that instruction will continue to take place on how to go to one of our libraries, our public libraries, go to the window where we have to look up research and an author and find it ourselves, and then sit down and have the ability to go through charts where actual documentation is there for us to view. And that is a big concern. We need to, even though it's not being used and we can click on Google right away and get information, if we recall what Kristen said during his presentation on the social dilemma, even Google tends to amend things. And for real primary sources of information, we still need to continue to be educated on doing the footwork that the elders were educated with. Local libraries, yes, you will not find the card catalog, and you will not be able to sit at a table and research, videos or methods of viewing documentation. What you see in the libraries are young children with their moms, which is great, storytelling, and you will see elders like ourselves. I don't see the young people accessing the libraries, and that's a skill we should keep and not abandon.
Any reactions from Sean or Hannah or Gianna?
Yeah, I agree with what Eileen and Peter both have shared, especially what Peter said about no one is too old to learn. But I also think it's important to remember that no one is too young to learn. And as these new technologies are coming out, and as all of this, we're flooded with all this information, it's important that everyone is working together to inform themselves on how to teach younger students on how to spot this misinformation.
Thank you, Hannah. And I think we have time for one more question. I'd like to turn to Meher, who before he strayed into the United Nations had an education as a scientist and engineer. And the question is very simply, why is there a distrust of science today? Any thoughts, Meher?
I don't think it's different than any growing distrust in institutions. I mean, we see, and it's not also fixed. I mean, it goes up and it comes down, but it's not as bad as we are led to believe if you just look at the headlines. I mean, we still, we all rely on science to do the things that we do. We are communicating virtually because of science. We are now seeing a light at the end of the tunnel of a vaccine because of science. So there's nothing wrong with science. Science makes mistakes. And I think what people haven't realized is that what we say, our scientists say at a given moment is based on what they know at that given moment. And the beauty of science is that it evolves and it accepts mistakes, and then the more it learns, the more it changes. So, for example, with this pandemic, and this has been used to criticize WHO and health experts around the world. And we remember this at the beginning of the crisis, even inside the United Nations, on one of the screens, it said, you don't need to wear a mask, which now we know was a major mistake, because the virus, the masks does provide protection. And the reasoning for, at the time, the information that we knew was not enough about the way the virus transferred from one person to the next, the asymmetric or asymptomatic people, and how they can be a vector in the transmission. So the more we knew, the more we developed the way we do. Normally, also, we know, and we have said this at the beginning, WHO and others, it normally takes 10 to 12 years to develop a vaccine. So we have to really take strict measures of social distancing, all the steps, washing hands, hygiene, isolate, track and trace, to be able to effectively end the vaccine, as some countries have done. And we can look at the great successes. One of the panelists is from Korea, South Korea, Japan, China even, and Taiwan, and others. But a vaccine today, and this is one of the reasons why people are saying, well, this vaccine was developed in less than a year. How can we trust it when you told us it takes 10 years? Because the amount of effort, collaboration, and resources that have been poured into producing this vaccine are unparalleled. We have seen scientists collaborate across borders, across university, research institutions, private sector, but that is why we are able to say, to see a vaccine with success rate according to the Moderna and the Pfizer and others vaccine candidates. There are at least 50 vaccine candidates that are in development. Some of them at different stages of where they are in terms of the trials. And there was a question in the chat about how do we trust this vaccine, and this is why I want to spend more time on this. Vaccines and the reason and how they work has been documented. We know historically that they have really helped us eradicate smallpox, almost polio. It only exists in 2 countries, and other diseases. A vaccine gives the body the immunity it needs to defend against a foreign virus, could be bacterial, could be viral. And the WHO has not yet signed off on any of the vaccines. I think they still have to look at more information, but some national governments have agreed, like we know the UK started today, the vaccination process using the vaccine with a 95% success rate. The CDC in the US is still looking at that, and I think one has to recognize that every country has its own traditions and its own regulations, and that's entirely up to them to decide. But what we will see is that the vaccine alone, as I said before, vaccination is important, but in the meantime, we have to keep the steps that are necessary to contain the pandemic and not say, the vaccine is here, let's go and party. Forget about masks, forget about washing hands. No, we have to keep this until this vaccine is behind us. And it also, these are actually good measures. I mean, this is probably the longest I have not had a cold, a simple cold. This year, I did not get the flu because I have been isolating with my family. Whenever I go out, I wear a mask, and that has actually also protected me from other illnesses and diseases, and as it has others. So science matters, and I think critical thinking is the core part of science. It helps us identify and evaluate the information before us. Do I believe it or do I not believe it? And the same way goes to journalism. You had a question about journalism. I think the notion of objective journalism is something that is debatable. I'm a big fan of John Pilger and what he says. The journalist's responsibility isn't necessarily just to tell the story from the perspective of A and B, but also to give voice to the voiceless, because sometimes that is a responsibility of a journalist. But can a journalist always do that? It depends on which media organization they work in, because media organizations are also owned by different organizations, and they are instruments of power. Media and information today is power, and I think we have to look at everything we see, even, so it's not only social media that is carrying misinformation, traditional media is carrying misinformation, so we have to also look at it. I mean, you watch one network here, you watch another network, it's as if you're living in 2 worlds, and that you can only verify by using critical thinking, and critical thinking is at the base of science. Trust science.
Thanks so much, Meher, and thank you for your initial presentation, bringing in the second V, vaccines and verification. The idea that whatever we have, whatever we propagate or project, must be something that we have tested with the 5 C's that we had at the beginning of our program as well. I wanted also to thank our other panelists. Erwin, I did not mention, which I always do when I'm with him, among other things, is a fabled restaurant reviewer for Pass Blue. And I think one of his last restaurant reviews before the pandemic shut everything down was at a lovely restaurant called Chateau 49, which is just a few blocks away from the United Nations. And I'd like to quote one line from that review, because it's so emblematic of what we're discussing today. Chateau 49 may not have white tablecloths, but it aspires to being correct. And that means you must take the time to do more than simply refuel, which is really what we've been discussing today. Take the time, be correct. So thank you for that, Erwin. Professor CTAUN, I recall that you had once compared your research work to living in New York City. It may be nerve-wracking, but it's good to get lost sometimes. How else would you come across the pleasures of unknown surprises unless you go beyond your familiar path? And I think that also is a lesson that CTAUN has taught us every year, that the moment we go beyond the realms of our disciplines, of our areas of study, into new areas, some by compulsion, as 2020 has taught us, others by choice, we enrich ourselves and we open both our minds and, perhaps more important, our hearts. Eileen, I recall day after tomorrow is Human Rights Day. I recall hearing you speak some years ago on education as a human right. And you're recalling a time when you had a guest from Japan, Miss Ando, whom you took to an inner city school in Brooklyn, and how she shared with them the story of the blue-eyed dolls. Now, the blue-eyed dolls, for those of you who don't know this, was a movement started in the United States in the 1920s, where dolls were manufactured with blue eyes to send to children in Japan, and they in return sent Japanese dolls here. But what caused that? It was the 1924 Citizenship Act, which was based on eugenics, on the exclusion from American society of people of East Asian descent. And that, again, is at the heart of what we're discussing today: misinformation and misleading propaganda, which ultimately ends up in legislation and in political activism. Peter, I recall that when you were at Manhattanville, you had spoken of your international bazaar there, and you had a wonderful phrase where you said, inclusion, and we're all about inclusion. Inclusion is one thing, but to feel pride for one's home and to be able to spread portions of what makes your country or your society great with others is heartwarming. And I think that, again, is at the heart of what we're saying today, that we need not be diffident about being proud of what it is we cherish and of sharing that pride. And here again, Peter, I think we may have occasional areas of disagreements. You say Zaro's is the best bagels in New York. As all of you know, the best bagels are made by Indians, and I would recommend the corner shop at 3rd Avenue and 90th Street for those. But be that as it may, I'm willing to accept that in the interest of your larger presentation. And finally, before I hand the floor over to Anne-Marie, and Anne-Marie, I must ask you also, please, to address one question which I neglected. When is the next CTAUN conference? And thanking you all for allowing me to be with you, let me cast your minds back to 40 years ago today, when John Lennon was killed on the streets of New York. And I promise not to sing, but I'd like to end with a closing thought based on John Lennon. Imagine no more misinformation. It's easy if you try. No time for rumor or false sensation. Just the triumph of truth over lie. Thank you and Godspeed. Anne-Marie?
And thank you so very much, Ramu, for being our moderator today, for offering all this insight and the excellent presentation that you have made. We're crazy about you, as I think everyone at CTAUN would say. I'd also like to thank all the presenters today for their most informative words, and all the CTAUN members, because how did we get this put together today? Thanks to the great team that we have at CTAUN, which I'm so privileged to lead. Thank you very, very much. And I know you just always do a great job, it seems. I'd like to thank all the registrants for coming. And then also remind you about our January 24th next webinar on the indigenous. You will be getting information about registering for that. But to end it all today, remember the 5 W's. And I think a slide is about to come up now on the screen. Before you share online, consider the 5 W's. Who made it? What is the source of information? Where did it come from? Why are you sharing this? When was it published? And of course, take good care of yourself too before you share. Thank you again, and stay tuned for the next CTAUN event. Bye-bye.